Welcome everyone. You're actually joining the first 2021 Education Committee session. I'm Cathy Algas. I am Peoria Area Board of Realtors Chair for Education 2021, and I'm joined today by Rebecca Gates, who is co-chair.
Hey.
I'd like to introduce our powerhouse panel for today. First up, we have Tiffany Harvey. Tiffany is a legal counsel with Prairie State Legal Services, located here in Peoria, Illinois. Tiffany is Tiffany is actually a staff attorney and project coordinator. She works as the legal help for homeownership programs. So welcome, Tiffany, and you're going to be talking with us today about forbearance.
Thank you. So are you ready for me to go ahead?
Nope, we're going to continue. We're also happy to introduce Anneliese Fierstos she is actually the new legal hotline gal. Most of us were used to seeing Betsy's name up there and Betsy's face, but Anneliese has taken her place. And most of you already know our lender experts. We've got Matt Wilkerson, CEO of At Mortgage, and we also have Adam Lofgren of the Lofgren Lending Group, part of Flat Branch. Thanks everyone for being here today. A reminder to everyone on the chat today that the chat is up. Please chat your questions in. We do expect to see a lot of questions since this is totally new to all of us. So chat your questions in. We will get to those at the end of the program. Okay, so if you guys can just get those in. So the forbearance thing, right? Like so many of us are just now hearing about this word forbearance. We weren't talking about it even a year ago. But the Education Committee felt that it was a pretty relevant subject considering what's happening out there. And I think that, you know, helping all of us be able to help our clients in the future when these questions of forbearance or evictions or foreclosure, moratorium, all this kind of thing comes up, that we can answer them. So forbearance, what do realtors need to know, Tiffany? You can go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you. So yes, my name is Tiffany Harvey, and I'm a staff attorney with Prairie State, and I'm here to talk to you about mortgage forbearance, specifically CARES Act mortgage forbearance. And I have to start with a couple of disclaimers since I am a lawyer. First of all, this information is current as of today, February 24th, 2021, but there have actually been some very recent changes to the program, and we expect that there will be more changes coming up in the upcoming weeks and months. So if you're relying on this information later, I understand the presentation is being recorded. Please check with a lawyer to make sure that you have the latest and accurate information. And then secondly, like any legal information presentation, this is not intended as legal advice. And we encourage anyone who has questions specific to their situation to contact a lawyer for individualized legal advice. So the program the CARES Act forbearance program that we're talking about today, it originated from the CARES Act in March of last year, Section 4022, and it created specific forbearance and moratoria programs for federally backed mortgage loans. And forbearance is not a new concept. I know Cathy said that some people weren't even familiar with the term, hadn't thought about this term before. So at its most basic, what forbearance is, it's an arrangement between, a temporary arrangement between a homeowner who has a mortgage loan called a borrower and his servicer, which is the company that takes the mortgage payments, where the borrower can temporarily stop making mortgage payments or make reduced mortgage payments for a period of time. And during this forbearance period, the servicer will not take steps they might otherwise take to collect delinquent payments, such as foreclosure. Forbearance is not a permanent solution, and the missed payments are not forgiven or canceled, so it's important to understand that upfront. So the CARES Act forbearance specifically has some features and requirements that we'll unpack over the next few minutes. And it offers eligible borrowers 180 days, up to 180 days of forbearance. And some servicers will start with just 90 days, not the full 180 days. And if the hardship continues, the forbearance can be extended an additional 180 days. So a total potential forbearance period of up to 360 days. And forbearance is available both for borrowers who were current prior to the COVID crisis, and also for borrowers who were delinquent or even in foreclosure before the COVID crisis, so long as they suffered a COVID-related financial hardship. For example, I have clients who have been in a contested foreclosure case for years, but suffered a COVID-related financial hardship and are now in forbearance. And then this slide just lists the requirements for COVID, for CARES Act mortgage forbearance. And there are just really three requirements. It has to be a federally backed mortgage. Again, there has to be a COVID-related financial hardship. And the borrower has to affirmatively request forbearance. Forbearance doesn't start automatically without the borrower requesting it. So the first question in figuring out whether CARES Act forbearance is an option is whether the loan is federally backed. And there are 5 different types of federally backed loans that altogether make up about 2/3 of the residential mortgage loan market. And so we call these loans Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, or USDA loans. So the first question is to figure out if the loan is federally backed. And how do you know whether the loan is federally backed? That depends on what type of federally backed loan we're talking about. Many borrowers are actually aware if they have a VA or USDA loan, because the VA or USDA may well be the lender on the loan documents. And also these types of loans are only available to certain borrowers. Similarly, many borrowers are aware if they have an FHA loan, they know they applied for this type of loan, and there's an FHA loan number on the loan documents. And then also those borrowers pay a monthly insurance premium cost that's reflected on their statements. But if an FHA borrower isn't sure if they have an FHA loan, they can check with HUD's National Servicing Center, the numbers on the screen. For Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans, most borrowers don't know offhand if their loan is owned or insured or guaranteed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, for one reason, because that happens after the loan is taken out. These entities get interest in the loan after origination. But it is easy to find out. They each have online lookup tools, which are included on this slide, to check if a loan is Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan. If you're still not sure, and sometimes there are some weird situations and exceptions, you can call the servicer to ask. It can be more difficult to get through to them these days during the COVID crisis. You can also submit a written request for information to the servicer about this issue or any other issue related to the mortgage loan. And I've included a link to the CFPB website, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with information about how to make that type of written request. And their website is a great resource in general for all issues for mortgage consumers. Moving on to what's required for a COVID-related hardship. A financial hardship is required that's related to COVID, but it can be either direct or indirect. So this is a broad definition that would include the obvious hardships, such as loss of a job or increased medical expenses, but it would also include things like increased daycare expenses because school was closed, or potentially even something like grocery delivery costs for a high-risk borrower who wasn't comfortable going to the grocery store anymore to get food. The application process itself is very simple. A borrower can apply for forbearance either online or over the phone. And there's information how to apply at the Chicago Volunteer Legal Services website for anyone who's having trouble. And the borrower should get confirmation shortly after she applies of being approved for forbearance in writing. And so far, we haven't really heard from many borrowers who are having trouble with this process. So as far as we can tell, it is working as intended, that borrowers can get into forbearance fairly easily. And then what we've talked about so far applies to all types of federally backed loans, But here's where things are changing rapidly and get a little bit tricky. Last week, the Biden administration announced an extension of the CARES Act forbearance program through June 30th, as well as a few other changes. So FHA, VA, and USDA have implemented all the changes the Biden administration talked about. But the Federal Housing Finance Authority, which oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, has not yet implemented these changes. However, those loan programs have implemented certain changes of their own. So now at this point, some aspects of the CARES Act forbearance program are different for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans versus other types of federally backed loans. And by the way, to make things more confusing, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac each have their own rules and guidance, but they are functionally identical to one another. And again, all this could change as well. So one difference is the application deadline. FHA, USDA, and VA loans have a firm application deadline by which borrowers must apply to get into this program, which is June 30th of this year. For Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans, however, the deadline to apply is uncertain. We expect a firm deadline will be set at some point, but it hasn't been as of today. In terms of extending forbearance for borrowers who need forbearance after the initial 180 days expire, the servicer is supposed to contact a borrower during the initial forbearance period to see if she needs an extension or if she's ready to move on to a permanent post-forbearance option. But if this doesn't happen, the borrower should be prepared to contact the servicer before the forbearance expires. And another new thing that now it may be possible to get back into forbearance if a borrower exits forbearance but then has a second COVID-related hardship. For instance, the FHA guidance now specifically provides for that possibility. And then another new change, in recognition that the COVID crisis is kind of outlasting the initial 360-day maximum that the forbearance program called for, there's now the possibility for certain borrowers to extend forbearance beyond 360 days. And that also differs depending on what type of loan you have. So for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac backed loans, borrowers who are in forbearance by the end of this month, February 28th of 2021, can potentially extend their forbearance an additional 3 months after the former maximum of 360 days. So a total forbearance of up to 15 months. For USDA, VA, and FHA loans, however, their new extensions look to the borrowers who were in the program at the beginning and are nearing the end of their forbearance program. So for borrowers who were in forbearance before June 30th of last year, those borrowers can potentially extend their forbearance 2 times for 3 months at a time. So a total forbearance period of up to 18 months for those borrowers. And then again, at the end of the forbearance, the missed payments are not forgiven or canceled, and the borrower will have to make them up somehow. But the borrower will not have to make up all the missed payments at once in a lump sum, and there are several options. So the options will vary slightly depending on which type of loan. The servicer will probably offer a repayment plan as one option, where the borrower would start making the regular payments again and pay something extra each month to catch up on all the missed payments. But that's not an affordable option for most borrowers unless their income has actually increased. There should also be an option to pay the missed payments at the end of the loan, either in a lump sum or by extending the loan term for a few months or possibly over a year. And then there should also be an option to lower the ongoing payments for borrowers who have suffered a permanent decrease in income or increase in expenses and can't afford their old mortgage payments. And again, the specific programs, specific options depend on what type of loan you're talking about. And anyone who works with homeowners probably knows that it can be cumbersome and time-consuming to apply for a loan modification. So the post-COVID relief options are supposed to be streamlined and not require as much documentation and back and forth. but we haven't really spoken to many borrowers who are coming out of forbearance yet, so we don't know how this will actually play out in practice. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning, borrowers who were behind before the COVID crisis can and do qualify for forbearance if they've had a COVID-related financial hardship. And in another new change, the new post-forbearance options are also available to these borrowers in addition to people who were current before COVID. However, I just did want to mention that some of these borrowers may ultimately not qualify for a permanent post-forbearance option. With each type of loan, there are limits about how much money can be deferred, the new interest rate, and how long the new loan term can be. So a borrower who has years of payments to catch up on may still not fit within the criteria for a permanent post-modification or post-forbearance option to keep their home. And then a quick word about non-federally backed loans. These borrowers don't qualify for CARES Act forbearance, and many servicers, but many servicers and investors have put in place COVID relief programs for all borrowers. So it's worth checking with a servicer if a borrower without a federally backed loan has had a COVID-related hardship. And it's also very important to find out what the repayment options will be, because there aren't those guarantees of a program that's supposed to provide for a smooth landing. So it's really individualized for each servicer or investor. And then if there are issues with CARES Act forbearance, then there are some steps that a homeowner can take. First of all, the CFPB link about requesting information that I provided in an earlier slide also has instructions about how to dispute an error by your servicer in writing. And I apologize that this slide, not all of the colors are visible. And then, of course, you can always contact a lawyer if you think your servicer is not following the CARES Act requirements or has committed any other violation of the law. Which brings us to Prairie State. We are a nonprofit law firm that provides free legal services to low-income and senior clients in Northern and Central Illinois with legal issues that affect basic human needs, including housing matters. And this is a map of our service area. And then our Legal Help for Homeowners program, which is what I'm involved in, primarily focuses on foreclosure defense and related issues for homeowners. And again, the forbearance is all very new, so we haven't really dealt with this issue much, but we are very familiar with other loss mitigation and loan modification problems. So we encourage anyone who's having issues to call us with their concerns about forbearance. And here are a few other resources. The National Consumer Law Center Mortgage Relief Chart is a great starting point if you need to look up the specific guidance for specific types of federally backed loans. Illinois Legal Aid Online is a self-help resource for Illinoisans that has a wealth of legal information and forms on a variety of topics, including foreclosure-related issues. The Illinois State Bar Association can provide a referral to a private lawyer for a low-cost initial consultation. And then I've included the HUD Housing Counselor Search Tool. If you're applying for loss mitigation or loan modification, it's often helpful to work with a HUD certified housing counselor. And then finally, as Cathy mentioned, we did include a flow chart which goes over how the CARES Act forbearance program currently works. And again, we expect to have to revise that a few times in upcoming months. All right, so that's it. Here's my email. And then if you are a homeowner seeking legal advice, then please start with our Legal Help for Homeowners intake line. And I've included that number as well. Thank you. I am not particularly a visual learner, but when we started these information presentations several months ago, one of my colleagues said, this is confusing. We need to do a flow chart for people to be able to break down how these concepts worked. So this flow chart, what it does is it puts it into steps that a homeowner would go through in determining if they qualify for a CARES Act forbearance, if not, what other options might be. And then due to the recent changes where the different types of loans have different rules right now, we've also broken it down a little bit, what the maximum forbearance periods and application deadlines are for Fannie and Freddie loans versus other types of federally backed loans.
Awesome. So the second part of today's program, we're going to talk about moratoriums. It's another one of those words in the real estate world we don't talk about much, but there have been daily conversations about the moratoriums that are out there for foreclosure and evictions. And a lot of us are interested in the eviction portion. So that seems to be a bit of a moving target. So Anneliese, can you go ahead and let us know, starting with maybe a definition of what a moratorium is, and then help us to better understand where we're at in Illinois with the current moratoriums.
Yes, and thank you. And I'll try to keep it brief. I will make the same disclaimers that Tiffany made. All of the information we have on the eviction moratoriums, they're changing on a almost daily basis. And so I'll make the same disclaimer because this is being videotaped. You'll want to make certain that anything that I say today is still effective at the time that you look at this at the video, because it is constantly changing. And I do recommend consulting, if you're a housing provider, consulting with an attorney with respect to the eviction moratorium if you decide that you're going to initiate an eviction proceeding. A moratorium is a temporary order suspending the right of the housing provider with their legal right to pursue eviction or a possessory action to remove or cause removal of a covered person from a residential property. So it's a temporary order. The moratoriums that are in place at all of the levels, county, citywide, state of Illinois, and federal, do not relieve any of the individuals of their obligations to pay rent or comply with other obligations under their lease or tenancy agreement. And nothing precludes charging or collecting of fees, penalties, or interest as a result of the failure to pay rent or other housing payment on a timely basis. So in other words, just like the forbearance issue, it's not, the rights of the tenant do not extend to including no right to pay their rent. They are still under the obligation to pay their rent. At the federal level, there is a federal moratorium on evictions right now, and President Biden extended that until March 31st, 2021, and that extends to all residential evictions. If you look to the CDC webpage, there is a declaration available on the CDC website for federal relief, or for a tenant who wants to state that they cannot pay rent. But that is something that Illinois property managers and landlords should not be paying attention to quite yet, because we are still working within the parameters of the Illinois eviction moratorium. So that takes precedent. When the Illinois eviction moratorium runs out, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, then look to the federal guidelines. And once we get into that area, the federal guidelines, because it goes all the way till March 31st and may be extended. I'm not going to say probably extended, but maybe extended. You'll look to the CDC webpage for guidelines at that point. Just like the state moratorium, it doesn't suspend any obligation for paying rent or meeting lease terms. And so again, landlords and property owners are somewhat protected. In the state of Illinois, our state moratorium is currently in place until March 6th, 2021. And as I said, once that expires, then you want to look to the federal moratorium and those dates. And then even after those expire, if we're months down the road and you think that you're safe and the federal and the state have expired, look to local ordinances, because Chicago has an ordinance in place right now, and that extends 60 days past the Illinois moratorium. So you'll want to check local law on any eviction moratorium. The state of Illinois moratorium is the one that's currently in place. It protects covered persons, and I'm going to have to read this specifically. Under our moratorium in Illinois, the covered person means anyone who meets the following metrics. First, the first category or the first criteria extends to income and financial stability. And it extends to anybody who expects to earn no more than $99,000 in annual income for the calendar year 2020, or no more than $198,000 if filing a joint tax return. Somebody who was not required to report any income in 2019 to the IRS, or they received an economic impact payment pursuant to Section 2001 of the CARES Act. So that's outlined on the Illinois Realtors webpage. Also, all these criteria for covered persons. So if you go to the Illinois Realtors webpage, you'll be able to look that up. The second category that's considered is if the individual is unable to make a full rent or housing payment due to a COVID-19 related hardship that's included but not limited to substantial loss of income, loss of compensable hours of work or wages, or an increase in out-of-pocket expenses directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The third category is the individual is using their best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual circumstances may permit, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. And the executive order defines the non-discretionary expenses to include food, utilities, childcare, car payments. There's a list, but it's not an all-inclusive list. There are other things that might be determined by a court to be non-discretionary expenses. And the fourth metric is the eviction would be very likely to render the individual homeless or force that individual to move into and live in close quarters in a new congregate or shared living setting that places them at risk to contract or transmit COVID, and the individual has no other available housing options. So those are the metrics that would be considered, and those are the covered persons who are protected under the eviction moratorium. But in Illinois, a landlord cannot commence an action against any tenant who does not owe any rent, unless that tenant poses a direct threat to the health and safety of other tenants or an immediate and severe risk to property. And law enforcement officers can enforce orders if the tenant has been found to pose those types of threats, a direct threat to the health and safety of another tenant or an immediate and severe risk to property. So just practically speaking, on the legal hotline at Illinois Realtors, and I'm the hotline attorney, the calls that I get really come down to, I'm not getting that much on this. And when I get the calls, it's related to somebody who wants to sell a piece of property, but they have tenants who are paying their rent on a regular basis. They're all up to date, but they want to give those tenants a notice that they would like them to vacate the property. And so that's where the landlord cannot commence any action against a tenant who is paying their rent and owes no back rent right now. They only can commence an action against somebody who is not paying rent and would not fall under the covered persons criteria. The process for starting the eviction process right now under the moratorium is a little bit more complex than it normally would be. I would encourage any housing provider to consult with an attorney before starting any type of eviction process. Under the current moratorium, the housing provider has to serve the tenant with a declaration form prior to serving them with the notice of termination of tenancy. And they have to give that declaration form to that tenant 5 days before they issue the notice of termination of tenancy. The specific declaration form is available on the Illinois Housing Authority's webpage. And it's important that the declaration form, even if a property manager or somebody goes and they look and they get the copy of that declaration form, when they serve it upon their tenant, they have to comply with the Illinois statute for service. And so that's why they probably want to consult with an attorney, because under the Illinois statute civil procedure requirements, service must be done by delivering a written or printed or partially written and printed copy of the form onto the tenant by leaving it with a person of the age of 13 years or over residing on or in possession of the premises or by sending a copy of that notice to the tenant by certified or registered mail with a return receipt from the addressee, and in case no one is on the actual possession of the premises, then by posting it on the premises. So in order to serve the declaration, you have to comply with the service of process requirements under the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure. The Illinois Supreme Court has also made statements on how these cases need to be handled, and they have ordered that any complaint that is filed in circuit courts on an eviction case need to be accompanied by a certification form that demonstrate that the defendant was provided with the declaration form in accordance with these service requirements. So it's not easy, it's complex. If the certification form is not provided, the court will dismiss the case without prejudice. That does mean that the property manager or housing provider could refile, but the initial complaint would be dismissed. If the complaint does meet the requirements of the executive order, then the case could be heard by would be assigned to one of the courts, and it could be heard. Just yesterday, the Illinois Supreme Court went a little bit further and provided even more clarification. And what the Illinois Supreme Court has done, because they're foreseeing a flood of evictions, as soon as the moratoriums are lifted, there's going to be a flood on the courts. And so they're going to get overwhelmed by these eviction proceedings and cases that are being filed. And what they have done is they've issued an order that authorizes local courts to implement dispute resolution programs, and in order to handle these situations ahead of going and presenting your case in court. So in other words, they are asking local courts to consider putting in place a dispute resolution process where if somebody wants to evict, they actually would request assistance in starting dispute resolution. So that's not necessarily great news for landlords and housing providers, because it's going to cause, it depends on what the courts do with that, because they're given some authority on how to implement that, but it could slow the process down even further in getting those evictions moving through the court system so that you ultimately get the order to enforce an eviction. It's really very important to also understand that although housing providers right now can initiate eviction proceedings against those who aren't considered covered, they aren't protected by the moratorium, housing providers can initiate those proceedings and they might get so far as to get an order. But the current executive order also states that law enforcement needs to delay enforcement of any order of eviction unless the tenant is a threat to public safety or a risk to the property. So therefore, because of that, even if you get a valid order, it's of limited use. One thing to note about the Chicago ordinance, just in my reading, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but that's why you need to check your local ordinances. It echoes a lot of the criteria with the state, the declaration, the service, and all of those things. But the penalties under the Chicago ordinance, if somebody wants to circumvent the process, are very stiff. And so you need to really retain an attorney in Chicago. And I have gotten several calls about could we do a do-it-yourself eviction? Can we just change the locks? Can we put stuff on the sidewalk? No, consult with an attorney, because the penalties are so steep. And I know that people are concerned about, some people are concerned about what assistance is out there for members of the public who are at risk. And there is some rental assistance out there for the tenants. The Department of Human Services has a homeless prevention program, and it works with local providers and has for those who are at risk of becoming homeless, or they've been evicted or are currently homeless. In addition, there are federal funds that are tagged for distribution, and they are going to be distributed based on the size of the community. And so keep an eye on the Illinois Realtors webpage, because our legislative staff is working on keeping up to date on all of that. So if you look at the Illinois Realtors page, we're constantly updating our eviction moratorium information as we get it and as we get more detail, but we don't have enough detail to share on that quite yet because it's not in place. And, you know, finally, also, I think people are really anxious to get some help for landlords and those who are the housing providers. And the Illinois Realtors is working on drafting legislation that they hope will outline a plan to distribute assistance funds throughout Illinois. It's very high on our legislative staff's priority list. During the lame ducks session, they tried to introduce a bill, but it didn't pass. But that doesn't mean the efforts came to a halt. They're continuing to work with, the staff is continuing to work with our local representatives and trying to get something out there so that when the legislation does pass and the funds are available to be distributed, there will be a clear and concise outline of how this is supposed to work, but that's not out there yet. The best resources out there right now when it comes to the eviction moratoriums in Illinois, if you look on Illinois Realtors webpage, right now, we have updated blogs on the eviction moratorium, and they're being updated as soon as anything comes in. Another thing to look to keep an eye on the federal moratorium, keep an eye on the National Association of Realtors webpage, because they are updating both on the forbearance issue and on the eviction moratoriums at the federal level. And finally, looking at Department of Human Services and the CDC webpage, there are also constant updates there on everything related to the eviction moratoriums. And please feel free to reach out to me on the hotline. You can email me through the Illinois Realtors webpage and ask additional questions, and I can get more information. And if you ever want to give me a call, the hotline number is 1-800-952-8056. I only say it 500 times a day. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free to give me a call. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's like a mouthful, right? For everyone attending today, we want to make sure that you guys, get the most out of this program. So make sure that you're getting your chat questions in, and, we want there to be some good takeaways here because, many of us have family, friend, or associates, that are kind of living in a housing crisis right now. So if we can have a bit of like a broker moment with the realtors, when you're working with buyers and sellers, always a good idea to, with sellers, for instance, when you have that first initial meet, asking them the question of, have you already enrolled yourself in a forbearance program with your lender? Or are you even behind on one single payment? And I think many of us are doing that, but I think that what we need to understand is as the pandemic continues, people may sink more than they were when you first met them, or may not be thinking about their payments while they're for sale. So a really good idea, 90 days in, if you're still on market, to ask again, are you current? Have you done anything with forbearance so that where they're standing? And then absolutely, when you get an offer, before you do those final signatures, a question again about, are you in forbearance or situation, or are you behind at this point on any payments, so that we can make sure that these sellers, aren't unable to close at the table when the time comes. And then for buyers, always important to just ask the question, are you current on your rent? Just to make sure, because then the lender issues will come in when you're trying to verify things. So we'll go a different direction now, and we'll talk to our lenders. And obviously the Anneliese and Tiffany offered like a ton of information, but I definitely want to get our local lenders involved with some questions so that we just all better understand. So Matt, if I can start with you. So my first question is qualifications as to who maybe was hit enough financially by the pandemic? Is there going to be any leniency in what you're seeing with maybe their current mortgage holders, or do you think that will exist?
Sure. So hello, everybody. I'm Matt Wilkerson with At Mortgage. And yeah, thank you, Tiffany and Anneliese. You guys did a great job and great content there. So as far as your question, as far as, qualifying for, some of the financial assistance or leniency, it really comes down to, what Tiffany mentioned in the COVID-19 hardship. Now, what I will say from everything I've been able to research and find is it's a lot more lenient and easy to put your loan into forbearance than it was back in the past financial crisis in 08, 09. I had clients that had just droves of paperwork that had to be submitted and pay stubs showing the decrease in earnings. And from everything that I've been able to look at is basically they just have to either provide a written statement or even sometimes just verbally document that they've faced a COVID-related financial hardship. And if they do that, then if it is a federally backed mortgage, then they're going to work with them to put that loan into forbearance.
So obviously, as people fall behind on payments, you're always used to having the late fees and so forth. Do you foresee any reduced fee structure for people that'll go into forbearance or foreclosure?
Yeah, so there are actually no fees charged when entering forbearance through the CARES Act. And basically, so that means the servicer of these loans cannot charge any late fees. But more than that, they cannot charge any interest on the loan that was different than the original terms of the mortgage. So they're not going to be charged any additional interest on a lump sum, but the original interest can still accrue on the mortgage and be added, at the end or due at the end of that forbearance period.
Okay. And the next question we had for you, I'm going to ask it, but I think Tiffany answered it clearly. And if you need to add something, Matt, please do. And that is, the payback process, what's that going to look like for our people that are in forbearance? And I know Tiffany did go over that pretty clearly, but what can you add?
Yeah, so, I think the key thing on there is there's several different options for how you can repay that mortgage or that forbearance back. There's actually 5 different types of, basically programs or how they can repay that forbearance. As Tiffany mentioned, the first is lump sum, right? Which we don't anticipate many people are going to be just coming up with a lump sum of 6 months, 12 months, or so on. They can do a short-term repayment where they, pay it in over a 6-month period and repay that back. The third would be kind of an extended loan modification where they're tacking it on to the end of the loan. And I would say that is probably most common. There are 2 other kinds besides that. One is a flex modification where they can also change the overall terms of the loan, where they could change the interest rate, they could change, the loan term, in addition to adding it back into to try to get that payment as low as possible. And then the final one is there's a cap and extend repayment period where they may cap the payment at a certain amount, or, if a consumer is really struggling, they could, stop the payment of the escrows into the escrow account. So they're just maybe making principal and interest payments. Because the whole idea behind it is, we don't want a foreclosure crisis. That's bad for everybody involved. It's bad for realtors, lenders, consumers. And so, any program we can, they're going to do everything they can to keep, these homeowners in their home. So.
Yep. Understood. So
hey Matt, sorry, Kathy, since Matt's talking about payments, are you gonna, I didn't see it in the list about stipulations for those payments when going into a new mortgage, unless you added that question. I didn't see it yet.
No, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, so, basically Fannie is gonna, very basic terms, they're gonna require you to be current or made at least 3 payments on a repayment plan before you can maybe take out a new mortgage. Matt, do you want to talk about government on those? I think they're the same, but I think you know a little bit more about that end.
Yes. So, I guess the key is as we're, as agents, you're talking to, either buyers or sellers, and the question comes up, can you get financing for a new home? A lot of people are going to have that figured out prior to putting their house on the market or accepting an offer. And the key thing there is, and this could vary from lender to lender, but as far as Fannie Mae, FHA, VA, Freddie Mac, all the government-backed loans, all the guidelines in the seller's guide require 3 on-time payments as a stipulation to be able to either refinance that loan. And then there's a couple other options in addition to if they didn't make 3 payments to qualify for a new loan. And one of those is a lump sum payment. So if they make a lump sum payment and bring the forbearance current, then they could be eligible for a new loan. And again, I checked with several different investors, and it varies a little bit. Some want the lump sum payment to be paid in full prior to getting a new loan, meaning they wouldn't allow a simultaneous close like you do on this, purchase and sale of a home on the same day. But I did talk to some other investors that will allow, for example, a copy of the CD from the sale to show payment in full and use that as a condition to qualify for a new mortgage. So there definitely are options out there for being in forbearance and then qualifying for a new loan.
Okay. Yeah. And that kind of brings up the question, like, okay, I'm not in forbearance. I didn't need, to take that extra step, right, for forbearance, but maybe I'm a payment behind. Adam, do you see the industry, showing any leniency to their current borrowers who maybe just fell behind on a payment but caught up?
So it depends, if it's credit reported late, I have not seen any guideline change on, what you can qualify for if you have a 60, 90-day late within the last year. So if they're falling behind, they're really going to want to get into forbearance before they start getting credit reported late. Because once they get that on their credit report, that's going to tie our hands with underwriting.
I'll jump in. For people in forbearance, they're not supposed to report the payments as late. So if you were current when you ask for forbearance, then that's supposed to protect your credit. Although I have heard that there's this other code like in forbearance, so maybe it doesn't have as much protection as we would have hoped, but there's some protection by getting in forbearance before you get behind.
Right.
Your credit.
Yeah. Just to add to that too, just the key takeaway would be, if you talk to anybody that's struggling, they need to reach out to their servicer right away and see if they can put that loan into forbearance, because once the damage is done, if it does get reported late or they don't make their payments, it's going to be pretty similar to, prior to the pandemic, because these things have been put in place for assistance. So it's crucial that they take those steps and actions.
Okay. And Adam, do you foresee, banks, instead of going through foreclosure processes, because I think we all understand that the lending banking institutions aren't going to collapse themselves just by going out the day everything's lifted and foreclosing on everyone. So do you foresee banks being more willing to do short sales in exchange for foreclosures, and will those processes be simplified?
Yeah, Matt alluded to it a little bit. Servicers and lenders don't want to foreclose. It is expensive. It's a process. I'm not the bank, but it's not profitable. It's not like repoing a car where they're just going to take it and sell it and get, it's a very complicated legal process to foreclose. So I imagine short sales will be considered more. That's going to completely vary from lender to lender, servicer to servicer, as it does now. It depends who you're working with. If you're working with a big national bank, as a lot of you listing agents know, it can be a process and very difficult. So I would hope and I would imagine they would be a little bit more flexible with those options. but it's really hard to say at this point.
Okay. And so the lending industry, like they're going to obviously be going through some kind of recovery period. So how do you think they're going to help themselves and to get into recovery?
So I was thinking about this quite in depth. You know, we're in a lot better spot from the mortgage industry than we were prior to the collapse. One, there's not the subprime as risky loans out there currently. Well, I mean, there's still obviously some from way back when, but you know, a lot of those subprime practices haven't been practiced in over 10 years. So you got that protection. The loans out there are much stronger than they used to be. And in addition to that, as far as property values go, you know, the appraisal process has become a lot more stringent on lenders in terms of all appraisals getting reviewed, you know, upon submission for quality standards and possible overvaluation and that kind of thing. So I think with those two protections, the mortgage industry is in a lot better shape to come out of this. Obviously, there's going to be, you know, a higher average amount of foreclosures. It's just going to happen. You know, short sales, it's going to happen. But again, I don't think you're going to see the combo of bad loans where the borrowers just should never gotten the loan, can't repay it, and have an overevaluated property where it's just like a complete upside down mess. Like I said, there's just a lot more protections in place now that will help us come out of this a lot better going forward.
Yes, and obviously, you know, the realtors on the call, our big question is, you know, how is this going to affect the market? You know, when we'll have more inventory at a certain point, which we'll all be applauding about, but we're going to have, you know, a lot of consumers that fell behind, you know, during the pandemic. And, you know, are we going to be able, will the lending industry tighten up then? And then we won't be able to get the people I could qualify today, maybe I can't qualify.
Well, and real quick, just to put some numbers around it. So, you know, I think in the total number of loans that were put into forbearance is less than 3 million. I think it's like 2.7 million. And so that's just over, in January, it was just over 5% of all of the government-backed loans. So I think it's important to have some context around that. And then also, you know, as the economy, everybody's expecting a pretty steep recovery as far as the job growth and GDP growth of, you know, I'm hearing 6%, 7% for 2021. So as long as those people have their, you know, income and employment, and it comes back, if it was the service industry or, you know, hotel that was hit really hard, most lenders are going to work with them to help them, you know, modify the terms and stay in their house.
Okay, awesome. We're starting to run short on time, so we do have some questions in our chat that we want to get out. So Rebecca's going to direct these specifically to panelists. So bear with us here for a second. We'll read these to you.
Tiffany, question for you. If you have a tenant on a month-to-month rental and they want to sell the house and therefore end the lease, how do you get that tenant to move out?
I'm not an expert on evictions, so maybe Anneliese could better answer this question, but I believe that those landlords are covered right now by at least the Illinois eviction moratorium, that they would not be able to get the tenants to move out until evictions can be carried out again.
Yeah, I agree with what Tiffany said, and I am getting that as a call here and there on the hotline. But those, if they're covered under the protections of the eviction moratorium, even if it's month to month, they cannot be removed from the property. Currently, that's the state of the law in Illinois right now.
So if they're renting a really high-end rental and there are cheaper rentals available,
the declarations don't take in, or excuse me, the moratorium and the criteria don't take that into consideration. They take into consideration, it's drafted to define the covered person. They don't compare the covered person to the status of the particular piece of property that they are in.
Okay, and I think a lot of the other questions that we're seeing on here, actually, there was so much detail in what you guys covered. I think we've gotten all of our questions actually answered on here. Thank you, all four of you. I mean, that was seriously like, if people's pencils weren't going and they didn't learn something today, just, so much new information for us. So really, thank you, each of you, for your expertise and how you helped us along with this today. Wanted to just make note that, the education committee, we're doing these trainings monthly. They're all, for the rest of the year, they're going to be the last Wednesday of the month at 10:30. We're really trying to bring it this year. So please let your other fellow realtors know. And if anyone is on the call today, if you took something valuable away today from this training, please ask someone else in your office to join you for next month's training, so that we can all together raise the bar in our industry. So Tiffany, thank you so much. Anneliese, appreciate the expertise, and Matt and Adam, always appreciate how you guys will, jump in and help us understand. So everyone have a very, very safe week. Take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.